Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Usually, we're trudging through medieval castle life with the familiar monotone of our usual narrator, me. But for the next few weeks, we're taking a small detour. This time, it's all about bridges. That's right, bridges. And you'll notice another change. Instead of the usual flat, droning man's voice, me, you'll be hearing a calm British woman guiding you across spans of wood and stone. From time to time, a gentle southern belle voice makes an appearance as well. Together, it's still slow, still boring, and still guaranteed to put you to sleep, but with just enough variety to keep you listening until you drift off.
A book of bridges. Literary projects may be put in two classes. Some are like steamers that go in a regulated course direct to their destinations, while others tack here and there like sailing ships, governed by a zigzag progress. Literary projects may be put in two classes. Some are like steamers that go in a regulated course direct to their destinations, while others tack here and there like sailing ships, governed by a zigzag progress. The subject of bridges belongs to this latter class. For 25 years, I have tried to order it into a methodized hobby. As well, try to teach a hive of honeybees never to visit certain flowers in a garden, and never to fly beyond certain pathways and hedges. Yet a writer cannot help rebelling when his chosen theme declines to play in the game of authorship, and deviates from many careful plans which are made for its benefit. Every chapter in this book has been rewritten 8 or 10 times, yet my sailing ship has not become an Atlantic liner. My wish for a long time was to show the evolution of bridges in about 700 photographic illustrations, with 8 lines of text under each print. And in preparation for this work, I collected materials and received invaluable help from other pontists, particularly from Mr. Frank Brangwyn, Mr. H.T. Crofton, Mr. C.S. Sargeson, Mr. Edgar Wygram, the O.M. Jackson, and the Church Missionary Society. Pontist after pontist sent me notes, photographs, sketches, and then Frank Brangwyn suggested that we should work in collaboration. Here was luck indeed. His pictures and drawings would be the book of art, and the rambling subject, if it passed over mere technique into the human drama, ought to interest the general reader who does generally read. For bridges have represented types of society, every change in their development having been brought about by changes in social needs. One thing more than any other is attractive to a pontist. It is the varied strife that bridges and roads have circulated, not only in military campaigns, but in the thronged struggle for existence, the one incessant war in the affairs of men. A routine of idle sentiment prattles about an illusion named peace, yet strife everywhere remains the historian of life, every effort to do and to live claiming a battle toll of killed and wounded and maimed. Even sleep, the nearest kinswoman of peace, is united to the law of battle by dreams that torture. A pontist, then, when studying the strife that roads and bridges have distributed, must clear from his mind the fanciful ideas that pacifism has invented. He is an adventurer in history, not an idler in a world of visions. Today, above all, he is called upon to see the truth, because Europe, driven by the rival motive powers of hostile ideals, has passed from industrial strikes and contests into other phases of necessary warfare. Once more, differing civilizations will have their worth tested to the full-on stricken fields, and once more, roads and bridges will dominate the military tactics and strategy. This great war broke out when my last chapter was nearly finished, and its early events illustrate and confirm the main arguments which I have tried to make as clear as possible, so that no person may think of bridges apart from their historic service to mankind. During many centuries, for example, all strategical bridges were fortified. Then a gradual decline began, and it culminated in the defenseless modern bridge that sappers blow up in a few minutes. Bridge builders everywhere have much good sense to regain from the science of national defense, a very difficult science today, for many of its methods are being rendered obsolete by airships and aeroplanes. So a book on historic bridges could not be published at a time more opportune than the present moment. Several collectors have lent pictures, and their kind aid is acknowledged in the Table of Illustrations. WSS, November 11, 1914. On the Study of Bridges and Roads. Chapter 1, Part 1. General Views. A pontist, or devotee of bridges, ought to be envied and pitied. His work is marvellously attractive, but he cannot hope to learn even a 20th part of the discoverable history which has circulated along highways. Indeed, the history goes back to a time that preceded the descent of man, a primal time when every bridge was made by nature, and when footpaths and tracks were the runs and spoor of wild animals, many of which were huge enough to plough their way through deep jungles and to trample wide paths through the undergrowth of virgin forests. There were 8 or 9 sorts of natural bridge, and they were all useful to the many quadrupeds that travelled far in their search for prey and forage. To meditate on this fact is to visualize many probable happenings. Vivid pictures live before the mind's eye, and in one, I see how a full-grown iguanodon, after gorging all day in a ravaged weald, was overcome by the sleep of glutted hunger as he tried to cross a big fallen tree that bridged a chasm nearby his lair under a rock shelter. And a flock of little bright birds came and settled on the 70 feet of body and tail just to pick up vermin. Why not? Life everywhere has fed on lives. Something has died and suffered a resurrection of vitality. Whenever appeased, hunger has renewed the health of an organism. And this picture of an audacious iguanodon and his bird friends attracts me for 2 reasons. It reminds me that bridges throughout their history have circulated strife, and it represents the perpetual law of battle that rules creatively over all living creatures, like foul manure over gardens and harvest fields. A pontist, then, must try to see clearly, under a form of visual conception, what part his subject played in the earliest war of organic life, when natural bridges aided the first animals not only to hunt over great territories, but to migrate from their first homes into lands very far away. In the second chapter, we shall try to feel the inspiring pressure of events, which must have acted during the descent of man on a brain remarkable for its imitative faculties. Perhaps we can get into imaginative touch with our earliest ancestors. Perhaps we can find in ourselves a vestige of their aboriginal nature. And then we shall know, by a sympathy which we shall not question, how each natural bridge helped them in their wanderings, and became a model to be copied and adapted and improved. Such is the beginning of our enviable studies, but their end is never reached. Not even the long days and years of Hilpa and Shulum in Arusun, where antediluvian seconds endure about as long as our trivial minutes, would be enough for a complete study of bridges and roads, viewed as inestimable servants to the commonweal of mankind. A complete study would follow their evolution through 8 worldwide subjects: architecture, civil engineering, antiquarian research, the development of trade and commerce from primitive barter, social wayfaring, war and its red tragedies, the longevity of barbaric customs, usages, traditions, and the ups and downs of fortune in the slow fever called progress, whose clinical thermometer has been tribal and national enterprise, and whose gradual effects on the temperature of bodies civil have produced many withering crises fatal to civilizations. These 8 subjects are vastly intricate as well as worldwide. In scope, they are infinite if we compare their magnitude with the brief seasons of our perishable days. Let us then ask ourselves a question: how much may we expect to learn about bridges and roads, the distributive agents of all human aims and ambitions? Suppose we live to be 80 years and 10, and suppose we work gladly for 8 hours a day from the age of 15 to that of 70, encouraged by perfect health, and so delighted with our work that we rescue Sunday from a Sabbatarian inertia, and lose no time at all by being drudges to the holiday mania. For a Pontist, never need be idle. Not only has he 1,000 problems to reconsider, but in all his walks and rides, he is a wayfarer with his hobby. When he feels cocksure, he can visit a detestable railway bridge and drink the wormwood of pessimism, and when for a whole week he has tried in vain to follow a devious fact through all its golf ball antics from bunker to bunker, let him go to a classic bridge, such as the Puente Trajan over the Tagus at Alcantara, or let him be as a delighted pupil to Turner's Walton Bridges, or to Brenguin's magnificent vision of the Pont Benez Eye at Avignon. From time to time, also, after paying his rates and taxes, a Pontist should recall to memory the rare great finds which his long research has unburied. To enjoy a find properly is to feel sure that one has made a gallant entry into El Dorado. Never shall I forget the elation that came to me when at the same moment I came upon two wondrous facts. First, that nature had created lofty arched bridges, like the Rock Bridge in Virginia and the Pont d'Arc over the Ardèche in France. Next, that the earliest archways in handicraft were copied from nature's models, and copied with a plodding mimicry, for they were built not with converging archstones, but with courses of stone laid horizontally, just as nature in stratified rocks had put one flat layer upon another, 155. To discover facts of this kind is a joy that keeps the heart youthful. Study is not a friend to the income tax, but it puts trouble out of mind, a true ni pen thee. Even aged scientists at the Pasteur Institute grow young and merry when they isolate a virulent microbe which for a long time has baffled their curiosity. Yes, research ought to be very popular. In its companionship, any person of sense may learn gladly, as an old boy, from his 15th year to the 70th, working daily for 8 thorough hours. How many hours in all would be given to study and thought? In 55 years, there are 20,075 days. These we multiply by 8, and behold, we have been sedulously youthful for 160,600 hours. Here is a record of industry. It may be unexampled until centenarians become as frequent as Mr. Metchnikoff wants them to be, and yet, after all, is it a great record? Great it may be in its relation to human weakness, but it means only a trivial apprenticeship to any vocation that lures the mind with illimitable open fields. Our happy toil is nothing more than a gleaner, but it should keep us from being prigs, little students overfed on a little knowledge, and too foolish to feel ignorant. What Sir Clifford Allbutt has told the public about the immaturity of modern science is true also of the study of bridges and roads. Here, too, knowledge is often hollow, while ignorance has a solid weight, even among men who are not content with current formulas. In every direction, we seem to travel but a very short way before we are brought to a stop. Our eyes are opened to see that our path is beset with doubts, and that even our best-made knowledge comes but too soon to an end. In every chapter arises problem after problem to beckon us on to farther investigation. Yet this way and that, we are so baffled by darkness and ignorance that to choose one of these problems for attack, one which is likely to repay his labor, is often beyond the scope of a junior candidate. Not that a young man should be very humble in his choice of a problem, for it is with students as with empire makers, who would do very little if a bold indiscretion were unfruitful. Let us have faith in the sunburnt cockiness of extreme youth. When it hunts the far horizon as if mirages of self-deception were the butterflies of ambition, easy to catch and easy to preserve, it is guided by the genius of research, and certainly it has done far more for the world than will ever be done by a reasoning caution that looks too far ahead. About 25 years ago, when I began in my leisure time to be a Pontist, a good old slippered antiquary gave me some hints on what he called a discreet fervour in the study of bridges. I was to choose an English county, perhaps Derbyshire, and for 8 or 9 years I was to live all day long with the bridges, getting them photographed from many points of view, and recovering bits of their stories from dusty old records and forgotten muniment chests. Then a clay-cold book in 2 volumes was to be written, with a frigid zeal for the accuracy of minute data. and with enough glacial footnotes on every page to strike terror into that general reader who does generally read. No thought at all was to be given to the public, whose vulgar mind had neglected the many antiquaries who had told the historic truth unflinchingly, with a desperate effort to be impartial, unemotional, and yet effective also, like icebergs. I told my adviser that his ideals were those of a studious millionaire. He could afford to write without heart and to be pleased with a bad circulation, could afford also to forget that old English bridges, though at times as charmingly rustic as the Robin Hood ballads, were not great masterpieces of art, like a good many old bridges on the continent. If I invited readers to dine with me on Brazil nuts, unaided by nutcrackers, how in the world could I expect to receive company? But argument was useless. The antiquary had two homes, himself and the past, and in both he lived as a rapt dreamer. I see him still, a lean and dusty figure, unkempt, unwashed, for he hated immersion, like Dr. Johnson. His favourite aim, and he never realised it, was to put a spade tenderly against a human skull buried in Pliocene deposits. I would sooner do that, he declared one evening, than be married to all the prettiest women in England. Girls, not widows, of course. Courage was not his forte, except in one pugnacious habit which he shared with most antiquaries. Not only did he love facts with a zeal that was always ready to defend them, but he regarded every fact as a big truth. The old man would say to me, for instance, hunt in the Middle Ages for common but shining truths about roads and bridges. Ah, yes, there's the fact that many bridges were property owners. Their landed estates were sometimes inconsiderable, to be sure, like the noble parks of Lilliput, but each estate, whether large or small, was a great truth in the history of bridges. And I like to remember the good folk who in their wills bequeathed money to their favourite bridges, like Count Neville, who in 1440 left £20 to Ulshaw Bridge near Middleham. Now and then the testator was a skinflint, like John Danby, who in 1444 left in his will a beggarly 6 and 8pence to Warlaby Bridge. Yes, and he was rash enough to die unrepentant. Another man, a notable merchant in his day, Roger Thornton of Newcastle, was clever enough to save himself from oblivion, a merchant's destiny, by leaving 100 marks to the Tyne Bridge in his native town. A bridge, by the way, that needed much renovation. But Thornton, in his charity, struck a hard bargain. The 100 marks would not be paid unless the mayor and Ye Cummins released the testator from certain actions at law. Thornton died in 1429. And to show you that the beautiful truth which I am illustrating was not then historically juvenile, I will mention an earlier fact from the life of a Newcastle citizen, John Cook by name, who in 1379 bequeathed 20 marks to the fortified bridge at Warkworth. The old man gossiped quaintly about his truths, but when he wrote about them, he was legal in profuse entanglements. Then it seemed to him that truth could not be protected by too many fortifications. Had he looked upon facts as facts, mere things which had happened, and which had no future, his antiquarian knowledge would have been less arid. But he belonged to a school of pedants, the same school which either kills antiquarian magazines or enables them to live obscurely on unpaid contributions. That a man's life work should be futile to the public, a mere cemetery where facts lie buried like fossils in a rock, is pitiful. Yet antiquaries are very proud of their barren labour. Scarcely one of them understands that a fact, however entertaining, has no value to thought unless it is a useful item in a mass of corroborative evidence. And even then it can be nothing more than a fact, a thing to illustrate the perpetual action of an absolute truth or the increasing worth of a given hypothesis or the general belief in a given theory. 2 or 3 facts that confirm each other justify a guess, a random shot, or a vague suspicion. An important collection of such facts, if it continues to grow, gives validity to a hypothesis. And when from many sources, as various as they are, many new facts are added year after year to the collection, until at last the cumulative evidence holds the field with the best judges, then we know that the hypothesis has been developed into a theory, the highest form of mobile knowledge in the realms of thought. But a theory is not absolute truth, of course. It is a harbor where knowledge rests while thought is on the high seas, a Columbus searching for new worlds. From a guess to a theory, this, then, is the architecture of constructive growth that research and revision build with facts. And if we as Pontists wish to think clearly and humanely, we must use facts as a means to a worthy end, as architects employ their materials. One by one facts are to us what a few slates and tiles are to a builder, but thought collects them, and then with care and inspiration she builds with them as she builds with stones and bricks and timber. In her work, moreover, there is nothing little when she does little things admirably, but when her devotees go away from her and parade guesswork as theory and fact as truth, we should ask them whether brick kilns are houses and stone quarries cathedrals. Today, unhappily, most people exalt facts into truths, and very often the great word theory is a journalistic term for any supposition that is loose or wayward or foolish. Thus, Mrs. Jones has a mere theory that her husband is hard at work when he remains in town after office hours. From the life of Bridges, we may draw a great many conjectures, suppositions, speculations, suggestions, fancies, ideas, and here and there we find some attractive hypotheses, notably those that concern the introduction of pointed arches into French bridges and of ribbed arches into English bridges. Are there any truths, any useful and necessary things that repeat and confirm themselves age after age? Yes, there are some technical truths that belong for all time to the mechanics of bridge building. The world can employ them forever, and always with the same good results, if engineers and architects work competently. There is also a great social truth in the life of bridges and roads, namely, that types of society are as old as their systems of circulation, just as women and men are as old as their arteries. So the condition of a body social can be judged accurately if we examine with care its landways and waterways. In Spain, for example, where the genius of modernity is inactive, and where fine bridges represent many dead social states, Roman, Moorish, medieval, and Renaissance, the past reigns over the highways, sometimes as an inspiration, as in the great and vast bridge at Ronda, but usually as a mournful historian. Even in those parts of Spain where trade endeavors to be modern, workmen have time enough to be honest craftsmen. Their metal bridges are not uncouth, and their stone bridges are charmed with hints taken from classic models. They do not progress, for they keep far off from that spirit of trade which regards the lies of advertising as proofs of a pushful honor. From a modern standpoint, then, Spain does not live except as a dim reflection of her long ago. A Pontist has few theories to consider, only two, indeed, and these are sisters. Let me introduce you to them. Preliminary considerations. We have taken a glance at the bridges made by nature, and now we have to consider their influence on the genesis and development of handicraft. This difficult study has been neglected by men of science. Not even Darwin said a word about natural bridges, though they were models to be copied by the sedulous ape in primitive men. And so we must try to be as thorough as possible within the limits set by a brief chapter. Where and how is a beginning to be made? The useful and necessary thing is to visualize the fact that varied hints on bridge building accompanied the descent of man, so the influence of their utility was active through all the linked growth in that organic chain by which the earliest men and their nearest allies were united. Sooner or later, the mere use of natural bridges would generate in some minds a desire to copy them. And although we are quite ignorant as to when this desire came for the first time out of the darkness, yet we may suppose, without any great extravagance, that it belonged to the same period of handicraft as the earliest manufactured tools and weapons, which were a development from stone clubs and spears fashioned into shape by earthquakes and volcanoes, the first armorers of the Stone Age. As soon as a tribe, guided by a savage of genius, began to copy 3 or 4 object lessons in nature's perennial school for mimics, the imitation of several others would be suggested by the same trend of thought, sooner or later. It is reasonable to believe that handmade weapons preceded handmade bridges, as hunting and fighting were the strongest motive powers behind human needs and actions. To slay was the herald of to build, so the first bridges of handicraft ought to be placed in a likely inference among the later doings of Paleolithic hunters and warriors. A horrible slowness marked each advance from a bad copy of a natural bridge to a slightly better one. In fact, only a few brilliant creative minds, not more than 2 or 3,000, separate our own social order from the strife of Paleolithic savages. Into the coarse dough of humanity, an infrequent genius has put some enchanted yeast, and we must needs believe that the dead routine of imitation, to which human nature has ever been enslaved, held primeval man even more relentlessly than it holds ourselves. One misfortune, more than any other, delayed a creeping progress. It was the fact that mankind had no cause to fear the most intelligent creatures among the lesser organisms. If snakes and beasts of prey had been as clever as were bees and ants and beavers, men could have saved themselves from extermination by one means only, by a rapid advance from frequent good ideas into great achievements. Day after day, the large human brain would have been called upon to produce large protective thoughts, and, had it failed to produce them day after day, the human race would have been food for enterprising rivals. We have no guess why Providence withheld from mankind this high discipline, this fateful choice between death and a swift intelligence. But we do know that the most dangerous of the lesser organisms have been the least quick-witted, and that men in their intercourse with natural things have shown a lethargic mimicry. Their cave dwellings were stolen from cave lions and cave bears. Their pit dwellings were copied from the holes and tunnels burrowed by many animals. And in their lake dwellings they collected hints from 5 sources: natural bridges, the platforms built by anthropomorphous apes, the habits of waterfowl, the beavers, dam and lodge, and the nests of birds. In the round hut, which was made with branches and wattle and daub, stick nests were united to the plasterwork of rock martins. Yes, a good workman in the construction of mud walls does no more than rock martins have done in all the ages of their nest building. When these birds make their nests, they use wet loam stiffened with bits of straw, and each layer is allowed to harden before another is put on in a thickness of about half an inch for a day's work. Even more remarkable is the fact that men may have borrowed from several birds the idea which enabled them to pass from round huts into oblong cabins. In Australia, for instance, there are 3 birds, genera of the same family, that build arched bowers with long sides, and Darwin tells us to regard them as co-descendants of some ancient species which first acquired the strange instinct of constructing bowers for performing their love antics. One species of Australian bowerbirds, the fawn-breasted variety, erects a platform of sticks as a foundation for its gabled hall of courtship that measures nearly 4 feet in length and 18 inches in height. This structure is charmingly decorated, and if we could magnify it to the size of Westminster Hall, we should be amazed by its beautiful architecture. Unmagnified, it is a model to all primitive men, for it shows far more invention than a wigwam or than a charcoal burner's hut. As soon as a student begins to understand what mankind has copied in nature's wonderful school for mimics, he cannot fail to take delight in natural bridges and their influence on handicraft. At first he is humbled painfully by the small amount of creative wit that 1,000,000 years or so have gleaned from the big human brain. But soon the novelty of feeling humble is more attractive to him than the vile habit of flattering human nature. Among the heralds of man, it was during the Upper Miocene age that 2 or 3 big apes migrated into Europe, probably from Africa, and passed from explorers into colonists. One of them was the Dryopithecus, a creature almost as tall as a man and closely allied to Hylobates. He illustrated that organic art of caricature in which young Dame Nature excelled, many of her experimental efforts having gargantuan humor in their shapes and proportions. When food was scarce, the Dryopithecus became a nomad, a sort of four-handed Odysseus who was very well able to fight his own battles, whether he wielded a heavy stick or hugged his foe, or from the shelter of a tree dropped missiles that cracked heads and made backbones exceedingly painful. Hugging seems to have been his forte, after clawing and fierce blows had prepared the way for a close embrace, and by his expert ferocity in defense and in attack, he earned for himself the right to be a forerunner of several entertaining creatures, notably the gorilla and the chimpanzee and primitive man. He was inquisitive enough to use every natural bridge put in his path by good fortune. At first I see him on four sorts of natural bridge, and no fault can be found with his activity. He crawls along fallen trees over some torrents and chasms. Across a flooded river, here and there, he leaps in a shambling, lopsided fashion when stepping stones and boulders rise above water level. He roams into hilly districts where many a ledge of rock spans a dangerous gap. But he enjoys himself most of all when a suspension bridge of branches enables him to amble from tree to tree across a deep-lying river pent up between high cliffs. In these four bridges, each of them generic, nature has arrived at utility in her usual manner by alternating growth and violence. The fallen tree, for instance, from which all timber bridges have been evolved by handicraft in a sequence of gradual improvements, belongs to the utility of nature's violent moods, and this applies also to the bridge of stepping stones. Earthquakes and floods distributed boulders over the beds of rivers, and from these boulders, handicraft has developed piers and abutments. On the other hand, a bridge of long boughs, and I have used many a one myself, is a symbol not merely of growth but of abundance, and also of endurance. But it is not to be looked upon as the only suspension bridge along which our arboreal ancestry capered, and from which primitive mankind took and take hints in bridge building. Let us remember also the pendant bridge of lianes, and of other tough creeping plants, which in many warm countries grew and grow from tree to tree, forming strong cables. On such a high-swung bridge I can see the Dryopithecus, suspended by his hands, and learning tricks as a gymnast, while his mate squats between the fork of a branch and collects fleas from her baby. When photographs of natural bridges lie around me on a table, there is another vision that comes before my mind in a succession of vivid pictures. I behold a shaggy little animal, partly an ape, partly a man, who stands upright on a fallen tree. Below his feet, a river in flood foams among rocks, and over there, beyond the peaked hills, a blood-red sunset makes a wondrous tragedy of color. Somehow the little animal is awed by the flaming sky and stares at it fascinated, his protruded mouth wide open and his teeth gleaming. His arms are thin, sinewy, capable, hairy, and very long. They hang at full length, and their prehensile fingers grasp two sticks, one long and pointed, another short and knobbed. His breastbone looks weak as his shoulders droop forward, and horizontal lines of wrinkled skin run from each armpit across the narrow chest. His legs are short and somewhat arched, and their feet grip wood as a habit. The eyes, overhung by a ledge of bone, shimmer with a peculiar suspicion, an instinctive cunning, very vigilant and fierce, that protects even tired sleep with the alertness of a sentinel. The body is daubed with yellow ochre and iron ore, as if to rival the colored life seen everywhere in nature. But through this decoration, much uneven hair is noticeable, and a coarse beard surrounds the face with a ruff rather similar to that which now gives pride to the Sabus capucinus. The head is becoming human, a real Pandora box, whence many banes and a few blessings will escape continually and spread far and wide over the earth. At present, this creature is a wild beast in the terrible nursery stage between apehood and savage manhood. Already he has lost the athletic ease and grace of his treetop cousins. Not only is he out of joint with them, but his own lot is very perilous, a never-ending war against hardships and dangers. Beasts of prey know how weak he is. Most animals outrun him. Birds in their swift flight escape from his weapons, and he feels rage and jealousy when monkeys at play leap long distances from bough to bough. Out of his nature comes a pitiless hatred for all living creatures. Do you not see this earthling, this Adam of evolution, part ape and part man, standing alone on a windfall bridge with a river in flood below his feet and the sun, a radiant crescent, blood red, dipping below that far horizon of peaked hills? And yet this biped has been moved by the sunset and also by an idea of his own, whose history can be read in deep lines of ploughed earth that run from the bridge to a wood over there, 100 yards away. At this distance from the river, a tall tree was blown down, and a tribe of ape-like men, guided by their leader, dragged it to the bankside and put it across the waterway, taking long days over the wonderful task. Nature at last has discovered a mind that can think in imitation. Her tree bridge has a rival. At this moment the picture changes. A female creature appears, accompanied by several children. She is uglier than the male, because she suffers much more, her family grows too fast, and for a long time its members are unfit to defend themselves. Never for an hour can she put aside her motherhood. Other animals are occasional parents, because their young are soon able to do their own business, while she, our Eve of evolution, forever anxious about her helpless little ones, is an incessant mother through the few brief years of her fertility. Perils encompass her and them, and in a short time she is worn into old age. But she loses her youth creatively. There is not a privation nor a pain that her constant motherhood fails to make into a spiritualizing of the heart, into a vita nuova, into the starting point for a fresh development. So she is humanized by suffering, and love humanized in spirit, that is to say, long ages before her body has matured into womanhood. It is she who endows children with quickened minds and with social inclinations, and it is she who encounters with a yielding but tenacious courage the wild beast that male passions breed and perpetuate. Also, and this is very important, she is by temperament a practical worker, whereas the male is not. He thinks all the time of adventure, and his moods are incalculable. Even his paternity is coarse-handed and subject to furious greeds and lusts. His brain is active enough to be awed by the strife of nature, and weak enough to be crippled by a little reason. His character threatens to check his evolution. Where the climate is hot and food grows abundantly, he makes no progress. Bad times alone compel him to work, and to pass very slowly, with a dogged reluctance, from handicraft to handicraft. His higher education begins when he chips a stone into a pointed weapon and feels the rhythmical enjoyment that accompanies invention and manipulation. In fact, handicraft is the earliest public school, the first university. It helps motherhood to transform the brute male into a being somewhat better, a primeval savage. Yet naturalists have confirmed themselves in 3 bad habits. They say too little about handicraft, they admire man far too much, and they patronize woman. When they do not bury woman in the term man, they glance at her with a condescending half-pity, as bibliophiles glance at second or third editions, and so it is worthwhile to do some justice to our primitive foremother, the Eve of evolution. With her incalculable partner, the irrational male, she and her family wander from district to district. At times, they settle under a rock shelter or in a cave and make footpaths from it to watering places and hunting grounds. Here and there a river is crossed by stepping stones, and more than one ravine is spanned by branches and by a fallen tree. What is their attitude to these things? The windfall tree bridge, like every other gift from nature, is a bane to them as well as a boon, for it is a road open to dangerous animals. As such, it is a thing to be guarded, and many a fight in its defense occurs, creating traditions of bravery which are long remembered. Further, as time goes on, and the progenitors of man become more human, the pressure of competitive life draws ever more and more attention to the incompleteness of natural bridges. For example, stepping stones may be useless when they are needed most of all, in wet seasons and after storms, and the tree bridge is so narrow that warriors cross it only one by one, so their slow attack gives a terrible advantage to a brave defense. These hindrances, so obvious and so unpleasant, make appeal to the inventive faculty that a few men possess. Not much is required. From 4 or 5 seedling ideas, a great many improvements will grow, and now is the moment for us to choose a vague, tentative date for the beginning of this gradual development. Most people are bored by prehistoric archaeology because its earlier periods are as undated as is the oblivion of coma. So a date in obscure history, however tentative it may be, is very helpful. The mind rests on it somehow, anyhow, and feels that the lost legions of the dead years left some oases in the Saharas of ancient time. And this point is not the only one that concerns the general reader, who does generally read. In recent years, the antiquity of handicraft has been extended very much by a find of eagle-beaked flint implements with other tools below the Pliocene deposits on the East Anglian coast. The eagle-beaked flints are undoubtedly of human manufacture, and they carry back the ancient stone period of man to the tertiary times. Sir Ray Lancaster writes on this important subject, and his knowledge helps us a great deal, though we have to recover it from entangled sentences. Evidence has been for 20 years or more in our possession, in the form of stone implements, of the existence of man in Europe in the warm period which preceded the Pleistocene, with its glacial clays and drifts and its gravels deposited on the sides of existing river valleys, sometimes 800 feet above the level of the bed to which the stream has now worn down its excavation, many miles wide. The discovery within the last 4 years of beautifully worked flint implements of the shape of an eagle's beak, called rostro carinet, and of other serviceable forms below the marine Pliocene shelly sands, known as the Red Crag in Suffolk, separates the migrations and mixtures of human tribes and groups of which we have any knowledge by a huge chasm of geologic time from the date of the earliest European population. The best geologists have come to the conclusion that 500,000 years, and it may well be twice as many, separate us from the days before the Crag Sea laid down its shelly deposits on the East Anglian coast. Yet there were skillful men, not mere ape-like creatures using sticks and roughly broken stones, but men capable of making and admiring symmetrical, well-finished flint tools and of using them to clean skins and to plane wood, living a human, creative, dominating life here in Western Europe in those immensely remote days. Probably enough, as great a period as separates those skillful men from us separated them from the earliest unskillful commencing men of the tropical zone. Gothic Bridge at Villeneuve-sur-Lot, France. Yes, probably enough, but yet we must not suppose that handicraft in Western Europe has ever had a standard of uniform merit, as our own work is very often inferior both to that of the Romans and to that of the Middle Ages, so the eagle-beaked tools may denote nothing more than a local industry which a man of genius had originated. No other implements have been dug up from Pliocene deposits in other European localities. Hence, students of art and architecture cannot accept the generalization advocated by Sir Ray Lancaster. As well suppose that the whole of Western Europe produced in the same age many painters equal to the Van Eycks, or many bridge builders of a piece with Caius Julius Caesar or the good Saint Benezet. It is enough to believe that at a date to be known vaguely as 500,000 BC, a craftsman of genius lived and laboured in a district of Western Europe, now called the East Anglian coast. How far his influence extended, or how long it lasted, we have no inkling yet. But it may have been the influence, not of a rare genius, but of a school tradition which migrating tribes had spread through many parts of Europe. Anyhow, the eaglebeaks are historic facts, and their manipulative skill gives us the right to make reasonable inferences. For example, we may infer that if the craftsman who made an eagle-beaked tool showed intelligence in some other useful ways, he did no more than common justice to his humanity. Suppose he cut down a tree with his flint axe, choosing one that grew aslant over a chasm or across a river. Or suppose he piled stepping stones together in the middle of a waterway. and then used this pier as a support for two tree trunks whose far ends rested on the banksides. Neither of these ideas has more motherwit than that which has enabled ants to bore tunnels under running water, and to make active bridges by clinging to each other in a suspension chain of their wee brave bodies. Not many human minds in any period of history have been as diligently rational as ants, but let us risk the conjecture that the first advance in bridge-making began among the Rostro-Caranet workmen probably more than 500,000 years ago. To cut down a tree in order to get a bridge at a chosen place was a good idea in primitive enterprise, but it was not enough. It gave but little additional help in tribal wars, since it repeated the narrow footway, the main drawback of windfall tree bridges. 2 or 3 trees laid side by side were necessary, and at least 2 piles of stepping stones to carry enough trees over a fairly wide river. Such were the first improvements that war and social life demanded from the wit of primitive mankind, and often they were demanded in vain for many long ages. Even at the present time there are tribesmen who feel well pleased with themselves when they make single and double tree bridges. I am told, for instance, by Mr. T. Beddoes, a traveller and trader in equatorial Africa, that often in his wanderings he has made and used a tree bridge to cross a narrow creek, following a native method for the sake of its ready convenience. The natives, he writes, cut down the tallest trees on a bank of the waterway that they intend to bridge. Then they make a handrail with bush rope fastened to short upright sticks which are placed about 3 feet apart. Bush rope is made from creepers or from long cane vines. Sometimes an attempt is made to flatten the upper surface of the tree, but this work is uncommon, as African natives are lazy. They detest manual labor. There are trees that grow to an enormous height. One of them measured 100 feet odd, so fairly wide creeks and streams can be bridged. But canoes are the favorite means of crossing rivers. They carry light loads well enough, and they need less labor than bridge building. This peep into the Aboriginal mind reveals a dire stagnation, but although no other thing in nature is less uncommon than human initiative, yet the men of the eagle-beaked tools may have made tree bridges, and also such stone bridges as the lintel slabs at Waikola. For this work required nothing more than imitation, while the eagle-beaks added some invention to a deft handicraft. Many an earthquake had made a slab bridge, and other models were formed by the lava from volcanoes, which hardened into a thick crust over many gaps in the land. From these bridges, a tree cut down with a flint axe, and a single boulder or slab laid from bank to bank of a stream, came 3 lines of descent in very slow yet fertile handicraft. And to the history of each a long book could be given. Let me name them one by one. The slab bridge with stone piers. In this we follow an evolution from unhewn fragments of rock upheld by stepping stones to cyclopean slabs of hewn granite and marble supported by well-made stone piers. The halting development of this bold stonecraft was loved and fostered by that original people which for convenience we call Iberian, and which at some unknown period migrated from Asia and swept round Europe, whilst a second branch colonized the Nile basin and northern Africa, and a third streamed east and occupied China and Japan. The master idea in the religion of this people was the cult of ancestors, and the rude stone monuments, menhirs, cromlechs, and kistvayans they have left everywhere where they have been all refer to commemoration of the sacred dead. The obelisk in Egypt is the highly refined menhir, and the elaborate, ornamented tombs of the Nile Valley are an expression of the same veneration for the dead and belief in the afterlife connected with the tomb that are revealed in the construction of the dolmen and kistvayan. What could have been simpler than the building methods of the Iberians? We see them at Stonehenge, which dates from about the year 1680 BC, according to the astronomical calculations of Sir Norman Lockyer and the late Mr. F.C. Penrose. Here we have the primitive circle of large stones and the rugged trilithon, 2 rude uprights or menhirs connected by a long table slab or lintel. There is a feeling for massive construction, but it is barbaric. The clapper bridges over Dartmoor rivers belong to this elementary craftsmanship. Each is a cromlech repeated in several spans over water, no matter when it was built. Among the ancient Egyptians there were kindred bridges, and the Chinese have managed to preserve in a formidable handicraft an Iberian fondness for the trilithon. Mr. O.M. Jackson tells me that many slab bridges in Sichuan have lintels about 20 feet in length. They are decorated by sculptors with a dragon's head and tail at the junction of two lintels and a stone pier. Every dragon's head looks upstream, and the tail curls out on the downstream side, so the slabs appear to rest for security on the back of a guardian dragon. There is a Chinese bridge of lintel slabs, concerning which very different descriptions have been written, but even the most moderate account makes it more than 4.5 times longer than the Pont Saint-Esprit. Gauthier writes about it as follows. At Loyang, in the province of Fukien, on an arm of the sea, there is a bridge with 300 spans. Its construction went on for 18 years and employed 25,000 workmen. Technically, it belongs to the same class as the bridges of ancient Babylon, which are said to have been made with long and flat stones laid from pier to pier. If Loyang Bridge be 8,800 meters in length, as some writers affirm, then its piers will be 4 meters 87 in thickness, and its spans in width will measure 24.36 meters. The footway is 22.74 meters. The long slabs are 5 meters thick and 3 meters wide. As for the piers, they are 23 meters in height and bear marble lions carved from blocks 7 meters long. Gauthier gives a drawing of this bridge, and his measurements are taken from the Atlas of Martimart. They have an air of great exaggeration. As Gauthier remarks, it is difficult to believe that the tabular stones are as large as they are presumed to be. Their bulk is more than threefold greater than that of the obelisk at Rome in the Place de Saint-Pierre. Besides, M. Pingeron speaks of them as being 14 meters long by 1.5 meters in thickness and in width, so he diminishes by a full half the length of Loyang Bridge. Even with this reduction, it is a wonderful achievement, more than 4.5 times longer than the Pont du Saint-Esprit. The dimensions given by M. Pingeron may be accurate. They represent a hugely magnified clapper bridge, decorated with sculpture and carried on tall piers for a distance of 4,400 meters in a series of 300 spans. The marble lions, I suppose, ornament the parapets above the piers, like those on the bridge of Pulisangan. Marco Polo visited the province of Fukien, where Loyang Bridge is said to be, and stayed at the city of Kuelin-Fu, known today as Qianning-Fu. Here he was greatly struck by 3 very handsome bridges, upwards of 100 paces in length and 8 paces in width. Not a vivid description, yet enough to prove that notable bridges in Fukien have had a long history. Tree bridges with stone piers. The most famous bridge in this kind is the one built by Trajan over the Danube, just below the rapids of the Iron Gate. Trajan required it for his wars against Dacia, which in AD 106 he brought to a successful end, the Dacian leader Decebalus being slain and his people subdued. The bridge had played its part, yet Hadrian, the next emperor, who began his reign 10 years afterwards, looked upon it as a dangerous highway, open to incursions from Dacian revolts, and for this reason he destroyed some piers and the footway. Perhaps Hadrian was jealous of Trajan's work, for 2 fortified gates and a handful of Roman troops could have defended the bridge against barbarians. There has been much controversy over this great structure. Its architect was Apollodorus of Damascus, who designed also the Trajan column placed in the center of the Forum Trajanum. A bas-relief on this column represents the bridge, but in a manner at odds with the written description given by Dion Cassius, who held important offices under Commodus, Caracalla, and Alexander Severus, AD 180-229. Dion Cassius wrote a history of Rome in 80 books, and a small portion of this work has come down to us entire. His evidence, then, is worth having, and it states that the bridge had 20 piers of hewn stone, 150 feet high and 60 feet wide, with openings between them of 170 feet, spanned by arches. Doubt has been thrown on the accuracy of this description because the bridge on the Trajan column is unsuited to a span of 170 feet. Nevertheless, 13 piers are still visible out of the 20, according to Murray's handbook. The writer has not been able to find any accurate measurement of the width between these piers, but as the handbook speaks of the length of the bridge as perhaps 3,900 feet, and as the Comte Marsili, writing from personal observation in a letter to Montfaucon, gives the total length as probably 3,010 feet, there can be no doubt that the spans were very considerable, and that the representation of the design in the bas-relief is almost wholly conventional. The one point as to which it gives clear information, not supplied elsewhere, is that the superstructure was of wood. In other words, this colossal work was a descendant of the earliest tree bridges, insofar as the footway was concerned. Whether arched timbering was carried from pier to uphold the roadway, as in the bas-relief, is a question of no great moment. The horizontal bearing beams would need support, no doubt, since they had to span openings far wider than the longest trees, and it is useless for us to guess in what way this support was carried to them from the lofty piers, which were built with enormous blocks of stone. The main point is that one phase of bridge building, whose first models were fallen trees lying astride rivers and chasms, seems to have culminated in the masterpiece of Apollodorus of Damascus. Much inferior work of the same kind, very varied and entertaining, has been common everywhere. Some of it belongs to Kurdistan, for example. And in the Ladder Valley, there is a good Welsh specimen called the Pontipant, whose wooden footway is primitively rustic, and whose piers are fragments of rock gathered from the riverbed and piled together. I have found at Thirlmere a quaint thing which is partly a dam and partly a bridge. The dam, an undulating wall of unmortared stones, has at equal intervals a few angular openings over which wooden handbridges are thrown. It would be easy in a shallow river to make a fish pool by heaping boulders into a dam of this rude sort, and the completed work would rank no higher than the Beaver's contests against running water. So I tell myself that many a tribe in the great period of prehistoric art, about 50,000 years BC, ought to have built for itself a bridge as elementary as the Pontipant and a perforated dam as uncouth as the one at Thirlmere. From this untutored handicraft, we look back again at the great art of Apollodorus, whose vast bridge over the Danube was near the ancient town of Nicopolis. What a long travail in the gestation and birth of infrequent ideas! Even 500,000 years ago, a man of the eagle-beaked tools may have put a boulder under a tree bridge because the tree was thin and swayed too much on a windy day. 500,000 years ago, and yet we do not feel ashamed of the Pontipant. Tree bridges with timber piles. Let me restate the first periods in their history. 1. A windfall tree lying astride a gap in the land. 2. A windfall tree dragged from a wood and put astride a gap in the land, perhaps by a tribe of semi-human creatures directed by a superior mind. 3. A savage of genius, perhaps as early as the Tertiary period, cut down a tree in order that it might span a dangerous creek or an abyss in the mountains. Intelligently, with the aid of a flint axe, he copied the work done by many a gale of wind, and in this act of simple mimicry he discovered the first principles of secure bridge-making. The footway was strong, and branches from the tree trunk gave support to clutching hands. Any bough that blocked up the footway was topped off. Even today we find in country woods a good many rustic bridges hewn from tree trunks and guarded at the sides by handrails of dressed branches. Their footways are no wider than the planed surface of a well-grown tree. 4. Another savage of genius, thousands of years later maybe, took a hint from a troublesome inconvenience which from the first had been present in tree bridges. The footway being too narrow, he put 2 or 3 trees side by side so that 2 or 3 warriors might cross it abreast, instead of weakening their attack by an advance in single file. But this improvement suggested other changes of much greater value both to war and to social life. However carefully the trees were laid side by side, their rounded surfaces left a valley between them, and gaps were formed by curved trunks and by gnarled excrescences.